Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much to the organizers as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I've never been to Luxembourg before, and absolutely loved it so far, so thank you. Today we'll be talking about the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. Here's a brief agenda for the day, or the next 45 minutes at least. First, we'll talk about briefly what the VDBIR is. I'll call it the full name, VDBIR, the report, kind of all of those interchangeably. We'll talk about some of the top trends that are focused on in the report, hot industries. These are all things that Verizon defines. Then I'm going to talk about some defensive techniques, and we'll open it up for some discussion afterwards. So what is the VDBIR? This is the 11th year of the report. Just a quick note, it's the 2018 report, and so that's focusing on 2017's data. I like to think of it as kind of a pseudo-random meta threat intelligence report. The pseudo-random nature of it is defining where the data comes from. There are three main repositories that Verizon culls. The biggest one, and the one that has the most confidence in terms of the Verizon reporters when they're creating the report, is from their own third-party investigations. So this isn't to say Verizon's breached every single year. That's kind of a misnomer, I think, sometimes when the report comes out. Verizon has an enterprise security team that does incident response and forensics, much like any other kind of Mandiant type of functionality. If an organization feels like they have an issue, they can bring in Verizon and they'll do a triage and investigation. So Verizon uses the VERIS framework. VERIS is the vocabulary for event reporting and information sharing. It's a great framework. I've used it in the past in previous analyst positions outside of, I've never worked for Verizon, but I didn't even know that they created it until I came across that in the report. But it's a great way to classify and categorize investigations and breaches. The second repository of data is investigators that are not part of Verizon's enterprise security team that submit their data to Verizon already in the VERIS framework. So that kind of has the second level of confidence. Moving one down, Verizon also has very good relationships with independent researchers in the field that don't use VERIS at all. They'll go and talk to them, get kind of a sample of different investigations that they've been working on, and Verizon will integrate that into the VERIS framework. So focusing on the meta nature of the report, we're not looking at specific techniques in a single incident. There are over 53,000 incidents that Verizon classifies in this report, 2,000 of which turn into actual breaches. And the distinction there is that an incident is anything that affects the CIA triad, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability of a system, whereas a breach is, as I put it, data walking out the door. So that's the kind of final end-all, be-all. At RSA, I've worked in our CERC, and we talk about incidents versus declared incidents. So that's kind of the divide or division between the two. Threat intelligence is pretty self-explanatory. Verizon produces this report in the hopes that we can all, as an industry, learn from the incidents that have happened in the past and hopefully prevent them in the future. Why does this matter? Why does this report matter? Well, marketing material. I mean, it's a joke, but it is quoted pretty much everywhere. And so it's good to understand the actual data because different vendors, including my employer, will twist the statistics in this report to whatever need they would like to fill. So it's very good to understand the report as the data itself. That being said, it is a great way to translate some of what's going on in our industry to lay people. It's very palatable, very easy to read from a non-security-minded expertise. Additionally, and I think most important to me, is that it's very difficult to get kind of impartial data sets of breaches from a wide range of different verticals and industries. And so I look to Verizon, and Mandiant has their M-Trends report every year as very good sources for this. I wish in our industry we had more of those. But I think it's hard to monetize them, and that's probably why. Top trends. So there are a number of top trends throughout the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. I'm only going to focus on a few of the biggest ones, including social engineering, ransomware. We'll have a discussion of insider versus outsider threats. Then we'll talk about dwell time, and cryptocurrency mining was pretty much completely absent in the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, so we'll have a brief discussion about why that may be the case. So social engineering. I think we can all agree that social engineering is a pretty prevalent problem in our industry, especially phishing. Basically, at least 2/3 of the incidents in the Verizon data breach investigation report directly come back to phishing. And I think, it's pretty common knowledge that it's much easier and oftentimes at least to ask someone to hack a human as opposed to hack an actual system. So that's very likely what's causing the spike here. Using stolen credentials is also the top of the list of data breaches. And again, that goes back to the fact that if you can, get your way into someone's head and get passwords and information from them, there's no need to take a technical approach. So ransomware. Everyone's probably familiar with the WannaCry attack. If you're not, all you need to do is ask any one of those companies and many more. It did not go well for them. This was probably, I know as an industry we have a lot more insight into the attacks, but outside of our industry, this is probably one of the biggest wake-up calls in recent years, which is often good for business for us, but it had some pretty damaging effects. Not only did FedEx crawl to a halt, but the National Health Service of England and Scotland were also heavily affected, as were some US hospitals. So speaking of the data that Verizon presented regarding ransomware, it was the number one avenue of malware, or use of malware across all the data set. So it represented around 39% of attacks. Again, number one this year, it rose from 4 last year, and it was all the way down to 22 in 2014. So ransomware has definitely had a pretty fast increase in terms of prevalence. We're also seeing more impact to critical systems than ever before. So it looks like attackers are becoming a bit more targeted in the ransomware campaigns. At least advanced and more sophisticated attackers are doing some reconnaissance and discovery to determine what an organization's crown jewels are, and then infect those specifically. Oftentimes that enables them to ask for a much higher payout because an organization really, relies on that data or those systems in order to function. RAS, as I call it, ransomware as a service, is also another branch of ransomware that's becoming increasingly more prevalent. There's an entire industry being created around ransomware. This is more commodity-based malware, not those targeted attacks that are impacting business critical systems. But in these instances, it's very easy to access ransomware services. And so they traditionally have lower ransoms that are asked of them, but with the increase in prevalence comes an increased cost like we've never seen before. Email, again, 92% of ransomware was delivered via email. So I think it's clear at this point that email as an infection vector is incredibly popular for attack campaigns. So now let's move to a discussion of internal versus external threats. This graph was pretty surprising when I first saw it. I don't know if I was drinking too much of the Kool-Aid when it comes to marketing, but I think we as an industry really overemphasize insider attacks. In truth, only 27% of attacks are insider. The vast majority are external threats. There are a couple of reasons I think this could be the case. There are definitely some popular examples that we can all think of insider attacks, whether that be Edward Snowden, more recently Reality Winter in the United States. There's a lot of damage that can be done by an insider. Insiders often have privileged access to our systems, but as we spoke about previously in social engineering, it's very easy for an external actor to become an insider through credential reuse and theft. Something that I found remarkable was 4% of users will click on any link that they're presented with. So even if it says like, danger, danger, this is bad, this will hack you, please click. They will click. And 4% sounds relatively small, but that means in a user base of 25 people, someone's going to be that individual that always clicks on that link. So this goes to a kind of outside of the report, but a different mentality of designing systems secure by default. And I think that's something that we'd really need to focus on in security. User training is great, awareness is amazing, but it's not solving the problem. Let's talk about insider threats for a little bit. The vast majority of these are due to error or carelessness. So that rogue IT administrator really doesn't happen that often. It's definitely a scary possibility, and it does happen from time to time, but the vast majority of threats that we're seeing are just kind of carelessness. I found it particularly interesting that healthcare is the only industry that has more prevalence of insider threats than external. And again, the vast majority is due to error or carelessness, and we'll talk about that a bit more when I talk about healthcare as one of the top industries. External threats, vast majority are financially motivated. I was surprised that only 50% were organized crime syndicates. I kind of expected that to be a bit higher, but the financial motives are rife throughout any sort of attack campaign. And so you don't need to be, an organized crime syndicate like you once did necessarily, because you can get a lot of these tools, off the internet now, with very script kiddie type of capabilities. Only 13% of the data set was found, incidents in the data set were found to be a result of espionage. Similarly, only 12% of the actors in the data set were advanced persistent threats. So I think much like insider threats, we focus a lot on our industry on kind of APT. While that does happen, and in public administration, as I'll talk about later, if you work for the government, it is a legitimate concern. But in private enterprise, it's just not seen very much. This pretty much matches what I see in the field. When I'm doing incident response and working on engagements, it's very rare that I'll see an incredibly advanced, sophisticated adversary really maintaining that the persistence. I see a lot of persistent threats through commodity malware, but not many advanced persistent threats. Dwell time. This is where we could all do a lot better. This is kind of an embarrassing slide for us as an industry, because 87% of breaches compromises happened within minutes or seconds, whereas only 3% of the discovery happened in a similar amount of time. So in over 2/3 of the cases, the vast majority, it took months, if not years, for incidents to be discovered. An interesting corollary to this is working for RSA NetWitness. I often see enterprises coming to me with a requirement of 90 days of log retention. And so I think if we look at that number, most people quote about 3 months as the typical dwell time, but I'd actually challenge that and say that we could only see it for 3 months because you only have those 90 days of logs, but it's very likely that an attacker was inside of your environment for much longer. So it's an interesting point. I don't know what that says about retention. I think instead of focusing on retention, we need to focus on visibility and getting out in front of these issues much sooner. So cryptocurrency mining. Cryptocurrency mining was mentioned in the Verizon data breach report all the way about 60 pages through the report for the first time in Appendix D. Appendix D was their year in review. And so it kind of goes through month by month, 2017, just mentioning some of the most notable attacks. 8 of those 12 months had cryptocurrency mining. So Verizon knows that this is a thing. It knows this is an issue that we're facing in the field, but it wasn't mentioned at all in any of the top trends, really anywhere in the report other than that one appendix. So I think something's a bit off here. I don't think it's any maliciousness or kind of turning a blind eye. What I think really happened, and in talking with some colleagues, most of them agreed that it takes a little bit for us to react to a threat as SOC analysts. It then takes even longer for our industry analysts to write and report on them. So I think it's just a bit of a lag time that we're seeing here. My guess is that in the 2019 Verizon data breach investigation report, cryptocurrency mining is going to be front and center, probably not dethroning ransomware, but way up there in terms of the top trends. Looking outside of the report, I think it's just logical to see cryptocurrency mining increasing in prevalence. Not only do you get immediate return on your investment, you can siphon out funds much quicker, especially at scale, but it's also relatively non-destructive. If you're doing it right or wrong from a defender standpoint, because it can be very easy to fly under the radar. If you're doing a low and slow type of campaign, you can persist in an environment for months, if not years, without anyone really noticing that anything's going wrong. There's also an interesting thought that I had when it came to cryptocurrency mining. I'd be interested to know if anyone in the crowd has any kind of thoughts towards this, but the rise of the cryptocurrency markets themselves in terms of financial gain, in my personal experience, also kind of correlated to the rise that I saw cryptocurrency mining in the field. And so I'm interested to see now that the cryptocurrency markets have kind of dropped off, if cryptocurrency mining is no longer as prevalent as it was before. Something else that has been talked about is that the former actors of ransomware campaigns have pivoted to cryptocurrency mining. That's not necessarily what I've seen and not what my colleagues have seen. We still see ransomware pretty prevalent. Cryptocurrency mining is just now supplementing that. So in business critical systems, if you have a very advanced attacker, do a ransomware campaign. Otherwise, if you have a whole bunch of hosts, cryptocurrency mine in them and do that low and slow gain over time. So now let's focus on some hot industries. Verizon breaks up the report into, I believe, 12 different industries, but we're just going to focus on a couple of the most important ones. So, healthcare. Healthcare is the only industry where, again, insider threats are more prevalent than external threats. However, human error is a major contributor. Again, that element of error and carelessness is incredibly rife within healthcare. I think, as an American at least, I can't speak for the European healthcare system, which tends to be much better, but when I go to the doctor, between doctors, nurses, administrators, there are an infinite number of systems that they need to touch on a daily basis just to get their work done. They're also not necessarily the most technologically savvy individuals, nor should they necessarily need to be, but this is probably what's causing a lot of the error and carelessness here. One thing to note within employee abuse, though, is that around 40 to 50% of the insider threats in healthcare are due to employee abuse. These are things like if a celebrity was treated at one of your healthcare institutions, employees are very likely going to go in and try and find information, not necessarily to monetize it, but just purely out of interest. Thought that was relatively interesting. In terms of external threats, ransomware is huge in healthcare. I don't know if you heard, but Atlanta, the city of Atlanta and Georgia and New York, or Georgia in the United States, suffered from a huge ransomware attack. It mostly focused on government institutions such as healthcare, police, critical infrastructure. So, locking up patient records so that an organization can't treat patients is a huge concern. Public administration. So this is where APT matters. In public administration, public sector, over 40% of the breaches were caused by advanced persistent threat actors, relatively nation-state actors. And so whether it's critical infrastructure such as voting, industrial control, more and more in the future we're looking at connected cities, spies are definitely inside of our infrastructure. In America, we often focus on the Russians, but I would firmly hold that American intelligence apparatus are firmly in a lot of other foreign nations' infrastructure. So it goes both ways, and it's something that we definitely need to keep an eye on. If you're in any industry but public administration, advanced persistent threats, again, not a big concern, but this is where you do need to pay attention to them. So the financial industry, I'm very proud in that I have a lot of customers that are financial enterprises, and they are doing quite well these days. They're the only organization over the past 3 years to show a reduction in incidents, and in fact, it's a pretty dramatic reduction. The current threats these days are mainly physical, whether it's ATM card skimming. You hear that a lot about at gas stations or bank ATMs, or ATM jackpotting. Barnaby Jack did the famous ATM jackpotting at Black Hat in 2010, still incredibly current today. Education. Education's an interesting industry when it comes to this report, because over 10% of the attacks in education listed fun as the primary motive. That kind of gave me like a warm and fuzzy feeling inside, because when I was a student, I was definitely doing things I shouldn't be, not out of malice at all, but purely out of interest and curiosity. And so we still see that is ripe and alive in education these days. This is also a great graph because it means absolutely nothing to me. If anyone in this audience can determine a, sensical trend out of this, I would love to hear it. The one nugget of gold that I kind of get from this is you can make a lot of trends in our industry. As I'll talk about in the defensive techniques section, reports such as these can be invaluable to your organization, but there are also certain things that you can't make trends out of. So if you're a defender in education, you're not going to try and, focus on cyber espionage as your main attack vector that you're protecting, because while that may matter one year, it clearly won't matter the next. So you need to take a very robust defensive posture when you're in a field like this. So now, going on to defensive techniques. Visibility is one of the biggest things that I wish I had more of when I was an analyst in organizations. When I talk about visibility, I'm not just talking about logs. I'm talking about network and endpoint data as well. Logs are great for getting that kind of knock at the door, kind of a little bit of information about what's going on, but it's really the network and packet data or network and endpoint data that I use in my investigations to do the deep forensic look into what's going on. It's impossible to really get the entire scope of the attack campaign purely from logs. So this is a great graph that Verizon puts out in the data breach investigation report. If there's anything that you see in the report, if there's only one thing you see, I recommend you take a look at this. It's probably very hard to see from here, and so let's just take a little look at a subset of that. So these are incidents of those 4 industries that I talked about previously. And this just is going to say that you really need to tailor your defenses, not only to your industry, but your specific environment. So looking at industry specific, determine what threats are most prevalent in your industry. You can do this using Verizon. You can take these kind of overarching patterns and layer them on top of something like MITRE's attack framework. I'm a huge fan of that. I understand they're giving a training upstairs. I'm pretty jealous that I'm not in that, but it's incredibly valuable to do this type of intelligence, whether you have a dedicated threat intelligence team in your organization, or if you're just layering it on top of some of your hunting exercises. So, for example, if you're in public administration, you're not going to try and defend point-of-sale systems. That's just not where the attackers are looking right now. They may in the future, things like DMV point-of-sale or Department of Motor Vehicle and other sort of institutions that have point-of-sale systems, but currently that's not what they're going after. You're far more interested, again, in that cyber espionage. And that, I didn't want to say it, that will be my one cyber for the talk, I promise you that. I can't believe I said that. All right. So you also need to maintain a security posture relevant to your own organization and the kind of capabilities of your organization. Emmanuel had a great talk earlier today at the top of the morning. Talked a lot about process, people, and technologies. It's very much true for this as well. If you're a junior organization and you have one intern on your security team, you're not going to ask them to hunt all day. Similarly, if you don't have a SIM, you shouldn't invest in AI, machine learning, deep dreaming technologies that aren't really going to do much for you. The last point is I also highly recommend that organizations create a report like this for themselves. It doesn't need to be anything external, not nearly as robust as Verizon does, but there are 2 main things that you can do here. The first, and probably the most important, is baselining the attacks that you see in your environment. This will help you fine-tune graphs like this, and you can layer your own data on top of someone like Verizon's. Additionally, it'll give you some ammunition to go to your board of directors, your executive team, and show what you've done. Oftentimes in security, I think we're, often ignored if we're not heard. And so being heard from normally means knocking on someone's door that you don't want to and having an awkward conversation about a breach. This is a great way to kind of get ahead of those conversations and show what you're doing and the value that you're bringing to the organization without necessarily needing to do that in an incident investigation scenario. So multi-factor authentication. I had to do a little RSA throw up here, but what we're really talking about today is hardware tokens. Google had an amazing report, or Krebs had an amazing report on Google that found that since they rolled out hardware tokens, and they do actually use YubiKeys there, they haven't had, this was in early 2017, they rolled them out. And since then, about a couple months ago, they haven't had a single incident of phishing amongst their 85,000 plus employees. So that's incredibly impressive. And rolling out something like multi-factor authentication is relatively low overhead. And so if you can do that one thing in your organization, it's a great way to get out ahead of the threats that we're seeing. Finally, just going back to basics. Talking about like Sysadmin 101, you don't need to have, the Battlestar ship from day one. You can just start patching and backing up. We talk about patching a lot, and I know it's not often as easy as it is said. Patch where you can. Try and have some political pressure, bring awareness to why patching matters, and backup is very, very easy. I've never seen an organization that has much friction when they try and roll out a robust backup plan. And that's going to help you very much so with those ransomware campaigns. Instead of needing to, hoard Bitcoin and have a special bank account where your company has Bitcoin on reserve, just back up every night. And if you get hit, go back to a clean copy. Next thing is kind of CISSP 101. Permissions. So permissions of least privilege, only give people what they need access to do on a daily basis, review those privileges on a quarterly or at least yearly basis, and make sure that people are still accessing the assets that they have access to. Netflix has a great program. I believe it's freely available on GitHub. Forget the name of it right now, but it will automatically roll away permissions on kind of a roving random basis. So if someone complains, very easily scripts it and turns the permission back on. But if no one notices that they lost a permission, they probably shouldn't have had it in the first place. So that is the entirety of my presentation. Any questions at all? I do have some discussion topics to spur debate and comments. Everyone is so opinionated in our industry. I can't believe no one has a question or...
So you are correctly pointing out the importance of patching and allowing for a patch where you can strategy if you can't patch everything you know you should patch. The delta there turns out to be really important. So energy spent auditing your patching strategies so that you know what isn't patched is actually got a bigger payoff than patching what you can.
Thank you. I think that's an incredibly salient point. Once you do know what's not patched in your environment, by increasing the visibility that you have there and increasing the monitoring, that can be almost as good as patching something in the first place. So if you have a high-valued asset in your environment that you can't patch, whether it's critical infrastructure or legacy system, at least monitor the heck out of it, because that's going to give you a very high fidelity return.
Since he's not here to mention it himself, Mitja Kalsek in Slovenia has a very interesting project called OPatch. I don't know if you've seen it. It's basically a micro-patch where he patches one single machine instruction where the vulnerability is. So install an agent on a server or a workstation. He pushes out a micro-patch, and the vulnerability is gone until the actual patch can be released. Or for unpatchable things, this one is harmless.
Interesting. The project is called OPatch? Yep. I'll definitely need to look into that. Thank you.
It will soon be available also for enterprises with a subscription where you can say, for these types of devices and applications, I want to be sure that there will be OPatches available for this and this and that.
No, that's great. I could see a whole bunch of practical application. Yeah, thank you for that. Anything else? Did what Verizon saw and reported on, does that make sense? Are those the top threats that you guys are seeing in your enterprises? You can just give like a yay or nay.
I just have a question. How do you use this report, and actually do you use the information that you find here in your daily job?
Yep, I absolutely do use this report. I've been using the report since around the 5th version, I think in late 2000s, when I was a SOC analyst. And so I would absolutely look at my industry, look at the compromises that are prevalent in it, and relate that back to the security posture that I was defining. So it's a great way to kind of find holes that you potentially have. Oftentimes, we need to be so reactionary in our jobs that it's very difficult to stand back and take a look at the real landscape of what we're potentially facing. And so this was a great kind of level setter for me. It's a pretty beefy report, but it only takes a weekend to churn through maybe once or twice and really get some actionable intelligence from. So that was the goal today, was just to kind of distill a bit of that to you guys. Hopefully you can take this back to your enterprise.
Yeah, so I just fell in, so I hope this question was not raised. What I was thinking, and I would like to have your opinion, because I was just like wondering, would it make sense? And I don't know if any of you ever did that, since the Verizon data breach report is now a de facto thing, and every time it comes out, people just jump on it and claim that they read it, but usually they didn't. At least they looked at the fancy charts and whatnot. have you, for example, I don't know, maybe you, Walter, but maybe someone in the participants, have you guys ever used the things that they list out there, all the metrics, to measure it in your environment and then compare it what you have as an average there? And would this make sense, since we're looking at, they are probably not the best metrics, but at least we have historical representation of, I think the most common one is the time to detect thing, that usually that's the most like referred one. Have you guys measuring that? Because still in a lot of cases in IR teams, they're not really looking in that one, but they do something stupid like the number of tickets. So would this make sense? What do you think?
Yeah, that was actually something that I mentioned. That was kind of a little golden nugget is I encourage, all the companies that I work with, all my friends that work at companies, to develop these reports internally. Again, don't need to be external at all. I don't know of a single company that has taken me up on this that does publish it. And they don't certainly need to be as robust as Verizon's, but it's a great way to, again, layer your own data on top of Verizon's to kind of make it sense a little bit more for you and to baseline your own environment.
And so compared to what you have as an average, like, are they below, under? Like, what is your experience? That they're doing better than the average, worse than the average? Are they even honest in how are they doing?
Yeah. So to speak to the honesty real quick, a friend of mine a couple of years ago took a job with Verizon Enterprise Security, and that was my first question. I was like, are they actually listening to you guys, or is it like a marketing, like a Gartner type of thing where they figure out what they want to say and then put some statistics behind it? And he said that no, the report writers are heavily embedded with the Enterprise Security Division of Verizon, and all of this data comes straight from the investigations that they do. So I was very glad to hear that. The first part of the question, in terms of really making this your own, I generally see a little bit of deviation in some of the attack techniques that are most used, but the trends in terms of the top 3 or 5 things that certain industries are facing are generally dead on. Little standard deviation, but I've been pretty impressed not only with kind of this year's report, but historically how well they chart some of the kind of trends in the industry. And there's a really good companion site to the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report that Verizon puts out that has all sorts of visualizations that you can interact with and modify to kind of even make it more your own. I'm still waiting for them. I've been trying to work with them to open source some of the engines that they use to create the report so that it's easier for organizations to take it, add their own data, and have a private version. They, of course, want that to feed back into their cloud repository, but I don't think they'd get much traction, if that was the case. So I'd love to see them have kind of a, offline version of this that you can modify for your own.
I have a comment again, if I may. On the KPIs of, like, say, the most cited breach statistic, data detection. There's a new book out that is on my Christmas wish list, and I really hope it's called Network Security by Wintow. It's an old book, which is called Time-Based Security, which, according to him and several of the people who recommended the book online and in the book itself, is a new security strategy that's risk-based security by miles, if you're aware, but I'm looking forward to reading about it.
Yeah, that's really funny. I had dinner with Win a couple of months ago, and I hadn't heard of his new project, and he was talking about it, and it sounds amazing. It sounds like it could be, we have a few canons in our industry, type of go-to resources, but a lot of them are relatively outdated at this point, and so I'm very excited to see it. I was kind of probing him to get a sneak peek, and he shared some things, but I think I'll need to wait until I get my own copy. But I believe it's out now, right? Yeah, I think it was released about a month or 2 ago, and so I should have read it.
So I'm still just jumping back a bit, what you said. So you said that some of your friends and you as well started generating these numbers and seeing how well you're doing compared to the average. How long they've been doing it or how long you've been doing it, and how do you improve? You manage to improve on those numbers, or and also, is it more something that you show to management, or something more that you feed in as a more strategic thing, or use it more for your like tactical needs and say that, okay, we're not doing well, let's improve on our processes and try to figure out better ways to detect compromise?
Yeah, I think both are very important. I think from a tactical perspective, creating a report like this for your own organization is a great way, again, to baseline. You don't need a machine learning algorithm to baseline some of these simple statistics. You can just put them in an Excel spreadsheet and see how it goes year by year at the most simple basis. Again, it's also incredibly useful to show to your management. I spoke a little bit previously about how security only interfaces with the executive branch during a breach oftentimes, basically when things go wrong. So this is a great way to get out ahead of that and show the productiveness of your division within an enterprise without needing to kind of have a black eye in the process. In terms of the longevity and how long I've seen people creating their own versions, I work with one customer who didn't even need my recommendation. During an engagement, I presented my report. They gave me a historical report. I believe it went back around 5 years. So they've been doing this for quite a long time. And what they've done now is they've integrated it with their SOAR platform, their security orchestration and automation response platform, to automate a lot of the collection of these statistics. So things like mean time to resolution. They have a little dashlet in the top corner of their SOC manager dashboard, so they can always see where they are in their SLAs. The analysts don't necessarily love that because it's very easy to profile them and see who's doing work and who's not. But it's a great way to help improve even within a SOC perspective. If analyst X deals with certain incidents much better and analyst Y deals with other incidents much better, it's a great way to kind of optimize workflows. So that's from a more tactical SOC perspective. I do have organizations. I've started writing my incident response reports in more of a framework like this, talking about trends, TTPs, and then vertical specific intelligence that I kind of layer on top of what I've seen in their environment. And then I encourage them, I leave portions blank, kind of a template for them, things that I didn't have the purview on, but I encourage them to fill out and then maintain that year after year. I think proactive hunting has become a big thing, whether specific to an environment or if you bring in a third party to do it with kind of an incident response discovery. I would highly encourage folks to do that. I've been a part of a number of those where companies have been going through mergers and acquisitions. Before they flip that switch and let the newly acquired company into their network, they do not necessarily a pen test, and not really a vulnerability scan, kind of a mixture of the two, where they do a proactive defensive exercise to see exactly what's going on in that property before they bring it into the castle. Did that answer?
Yeah, well, just getting back in terms of improvement, are they able to, I'm not saying that they should, strive for just moving the needle, but they're really able to, because once you see this data, then you realize that you might not doing as well as you thought. Are they have in their program, once they start measuring these, a point where they try to improve on that, and if they're able to do that. So, for example, in one case, like the mean time to detect dropped in the past few years. A lot of people tie that to the fact that now ransomware was a thing. So they take into account as well. So how do they improve on it? That would be interesting for me.
Yeah, I've definitely seen improvement. I think the biggest way that I've seen improvement is budgetary. If you have a report like this explaining exactly what the trends are in your environment, you can take that to leadership and say, this is the justification for this technology.
Yeah, like giving them actual numbers. Yeah, instead of just saying that we need more money. Yeah,
exactly. But I have seen it improve with training as well. So if you're an organization that's facing 4 different threats and you see one of them is affecting you a lot more, that's a good indication that your knowledge base is lacking in that one area from a defensive standpoint. So whether you bring someone in who's an expert in that field, or if you pollinate your own existing analysts with training, I've seen that work as well. In one particular example, someone was getting nailed with web application stuff, and they had no idea what was coming in through that vector. They thought it was a much different type of attack. And so they schooled up one of their analysts actually through SANS training, and that did make a marked decrease in that attack vector. It was also a very limited actor, so I think just recognizing it in the first place was a big step forward for them. But then to have those technical chops on your team prevents those types of things from happening in the future.
So no other questions? Yeah, sure.
It's a good topic. So a few years ago, they changed the way that they presented the top vulnerabilities used to compromise companies. And the data that went into the report was totally wrong. Every single vulnerability in there was wrong. They messed it up somehow. I think they republished with the correct vulnerabilities. But then in the last one, they took this out entirely. Which I found interesting and relevant, because I can also tie it to the OWASP top 10, which someone just analyzed in the respect of which vulnerabilities were actually used to compromise companies. Again, similar to what Verizon wanted to do and stopped doing. What do you think of Verizon taking out data from this report that some of us considered valuable?
Yeah, to be completely honest, that was very disappointing for me as well. It is in the report here and there in some of the appendices. The online companion tool actually does the best way of kind of getting to the granularity of the actual tactics and techniques that are being used. I think, so my perspective on that, and correct me if you have a different one, what I saw happening was a lot of attribution being surrounded by those certain tactics and techniques. So if you saw a certain rootkit, let's say, being used, there was such a media focus now in our industry that they'd initially or automatically pretty much assign a specific attribution to that. This was North Korea. And I think, we can probably all agree that's incredibly dangerous. Attribution is not a game that I ever want to play due to a number of factors. But that's kind of where I sensed it going in terms of Verizon no longer wanted to put their name behind this as this technique equals this person. They certainly weren't making that jump in the report, but I think a lot of the media attention started going there where they're saying Verizon saying that, Fancy Bear is using this against these industries. That's not what they were doing, but it was easier and easier as more of these techniques were getting associated with actors to make those leaps in popular media, at least. I do wish there was a good resource for that. I think MITRE has really kind of filled that gap. The attack framework does have pretty good granularity, sometimes too much granularity. When I show it to some of my customers, they're like, "Whoa, this has like 128 boxes. Like, can we get like 4?" And, there's definitely value, immense value, I think, in the granularity that they take it. But some middle ground, at least for director, manager levels, would be appreciated. I think they always featured that in the executive summary. So not only was it in the full report, but even if you had, somewhat of a layperson without, who doesn't live and breathe security like we do, they could still easily digest those TTPs. Yeah.
Any other question, Klaus? No? Yeah, we still have 15 minutes, so we are in advance on the break. Okay, so thank you, Walter.
Thank you, guys.